Good night, my family and friends. Once again, I'm back with another live study as I continue in the several part study on the whole matter of Sabbatarianism, and this will be part 3, where I'll be looking at the fact that the Sabbath was never a law that was binding on Gentiles. I hope those of you who have been following me so far, who have been watching these studies, you have been blessed. I hope that the scriptural facts, the historical facts concerning the Sabbath has been very clear for you, and that if you had any kind of compunctions and stuff that held your mind captive to mandatory Sabbatarianism, I hope that those would be removed after we would have, finished these studies. We looked at the covenants, the Old and New covenants, which are relevant to the discussion on Sabbatarianism, where the Old covenant is abolished. We are under the New covenant as Christians and believers. And the sign of that Old covenant was definitely the Sabbath, whereas for the New covenant, it is the Holy Spirit and the Lord's Supper. We saw that the Sabbath was exclusively for the Jews. We saw how the Sabbath is clearly stated to be kept in Scripture, the various rules about it, who it applied to, and all of these things. And so there should be no ifs and buts in our minds regarding Sabbatarianism. Nice to see you, my friends joining me, Brother Larry, Stephen Baxter. Nice to see you, Elder. I really enjoyed your story, man. I was very moved and impressed with what God is doing in your life. I encourage you to keep on doing what you're doing. You're doing a great work. I'm happy to be among, in your group, to be able to share and for us to discuss and to learn from each other. So nice to see you joining me tonight. Sister Marcy, you're the boss, Nice to have you, Marcia. You're one of my towers of strength, and I really appreciate you and the way God used you to minister to me and my family and to strengthen and encourage me in these situations, and to keep pushing me to keep on keeping on. And Brother Larry, I really enjoyed interactions. They have been wonderfully well. Your insight, wisdom, the humility is profound, and I really enjoy it. All right, so tonight we will be looking at the fact that the Sabbath was never a law for Gentiles. Now, as I say, those of you who are well read and studied in these matters, you should know these things. Nevertheless, they're always refreshing to actually look into these things and to be reminded of them. And so I do hope you would be tremendously blessed nonetheless by the study tonight. I'm just going to be looking at a few selected Old Testament passages that make it absolutely clear. As you say, Stephen, the Sabbath was for a specific people, for a specific time, living in a specific geographical location, and may I add, under a specific covenant, which was the Old Covenant. That is exactly right. And so tonight we will see just that. Now, Gentiles, as you should know, are all non-Jews. The biblical and covenantal world is literally divided into two groups. There is the Jews, who were God's chosen covenant people, through whom the promises, the Messiah, and everybody, relating to a covenant and salvation history came. And then there are Gentiles. You read Romans chapter 9, Paul says that clearly. Speaking of Israel, to them the fathers came, through whom Christ came. To them belong the laws and the covenants and all of these things. Ephesians chapter 2 classifies them as the circumcision and uncircumcision. Jews were the circumcision, Gentiles were the uncircumcision. All of these different terms describe these two categories. In the Hebrew, it's they're named after Judah, or well, just Hebrews, and the Gentiles are just goyim, the masses, you know, the ones who are not a part of Israel. And in the Greek is Iudaios, you know, Jews, and Gentiles are ethnos, the people, the masses, non-Jews, the uncircumcised, etc. And this distinction is maintained throughout Scripture. And we will see clearly that the Sabbath was never a law that Gentiles were given or expected to keep unless they became a part of Israel. And the first instance of this we find is in Exodus chapter 16, verses 23 to 30, where we can observe for the very first time the mention of the Sabbath in the history of humanity. This might appear to be a very bold statement, as some persons think that the Sabbath was from Eden in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. But those of you who have been following the studies, you know, I touched adequately that Genesis chapter 2 is not talking about the Sabbath. It has nothing to do with man. There's no command for any man to observe anything. It's everything to do with God. Having created everything, God ceases his creation, and he blessed that specific seventh day, not every subsequent seventh day of creation. And humanity was supposed to remain with God in that perpetual state of rest and blessedness. And we had seen where Hebrews spoke of how that rest remains to this day, and anyone can enter into it. When we hear the gospel and believe, we instantaneously enter into God's rest. I had broken that down adequately. And of course, you know, my book is out now. Some of you have it already. Those of you who don't, you can access it, where I deal with these things thorough for you know, better explanation and justification of these facts. So there's no Sabbath in Genesis chapter 2. No one in the entire history of Genesis up to Exodus 16 knew of any Sabbath or kept any Sabbath where the Israelites are concerned. Deuteronomy chapter 5 verses 2 and 3 we had seen, where it explicitly stated that the Israelite fathers, you know, did not have the covenant that God made with Israel. And we see right there in Deuteronomy that the very words or the foundation of the covenant were the 10 Commandments, the Old Covenant, and the Sabbath is the sign or seal of that covenant. So if they never had that covenant, then they definitely could not have the seal of that specific covenant. So that automatically throws out the idea that patriarchs kept the Sabbath in Genesis, or anyone knew of anything named the Sabbath. Now, Exodus chapter 22, we see where God is about to give the Israelites this law, and the very Hebrew linguistics, the indefinite article, you know, the indefinite noun there, Sabbath, that is used, you know, tells you is not it was not already known, you know, the way the Hebrew linguistics is worded when I read some authorities on this. So on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each man. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath." The indefinite there, correctly translated in the ESV. "To the Lord, bake what you will bake today, boil what you will boil, all that's left over to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside as Moses commanded. It didn't stink, nor were there any worms in it. And Moses said to them now, in verse 25, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you won't find any in the field. 6 days you will gather it. On the 7th day there will be none." And some of the people who were stubborn, they went to gather on the 7th day. There were none. And then God says, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? He's given you a Sabbath. Therefore, gather for 6 days. There would be none on the 7th. And you must remain in your place." And so the people rested. Now, from the way we even see this worded, we can see that this is something that the Israelites were new to. The fact that Moses have to tell them, "This is what God has said to me, guys. Tomorrow is a Sabbath." Now, if they already knew of the Sabbath and it was passed on from generation, Moses would not have any need to tell them of this law that they supposedly were keeping from Genesis chapter 2 and from generation to generation. I mean, look at marriage and worshiping of Yahweh and morality. These things were not needed to tell them, because they knew these things. It was embedded in their hearts, you know, their oral tradition. These things were passed on. They knew their lineage and everything. But as it regards to the Sabbath, this is a whole new law that is being given to them, and specific instructions ought to be given as to how they ought to keep this new law. So if they had knew this Sabbath before, and if they had kept it the week before, then it follows through that Moses would not have to tell them, hey, tomorrow's the day of rest, as they would have already been cognizant of it and would have been already keeping this day. But no, what we see is Moses have to tell them, tomorrow's a day of rest, it's the Sabbath to the Lord, and this is how you ought to keep it. You know, do all your cooking and preparation today. You won't find any in the field tomorrow, etc. So this is the very first mention, especially where Hebrew linguistics is concerned, of the Sabbath in the Bible. And we are seeing clearly here this is specifically relative to the children of Israel. There are some things that we can observe from this passage. However, we will only note what is relevant to the issue under discussion. Notice carefully that the instructions are given to Israel, and when some of the people violated the command to keep the seventh day as stipulated by God, in verse 28 God says, how long you, Israel, refuse to keep my laws. In Exodus chapter 20, this is like 2 weeks later, God officially makes the covenant with Israel, and in this covenant is contained the Sabbath command. Exodus chapter 20 verse 2 reads, I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This is the preamble to the covenant. All suzerain treaties had these, features. Again, you can consult a treaty of the Great King by Meredith Kline, which is one of the top authorities, in covenant treaties of the ancient Near East, where these things are documented, beyond a shadow of a doubt. No honest, serious scholar take these things lightly or say, well, this is, this is not so. So God gives the preamble, I'm the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. There should be no doubt as to whom God is speaking here. Only Israel was delivered from Egyptian slavery. Then in verse 11, now as God stipulates the very words of the covenant, he says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. And this is exactly how it is in the Hebrew. It's indefinite. It's a Sabbath among the other Sabbaths. On it you won't do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female slave, your livestock, or a stranger who's within your gates. Because in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So in this commandment we can observe Israel is explicitly commanded to remember the Sabbath. Remember here does not mean that they had knew it from eons before. Remember, this is like the third week after they were firstly introduced to it. So the remember here can be looking back at the 2 Sabbaths before they would have kept before this is officially enshrined in the covenant, as well as remember looking forward to the future. So remember here does not mean from eons ago, from all eternity, and they ought to keep it into remembrance as some assumptions, Adventist assumptions specifically would like us to believe. It's just like if I'm sending my son to the store to buy something and I want to stress the importance of, let's say an orange juice that I really need, and I say to him, remember to bring me the orange juice. So I send him with a list of items. I say, remember the orange juice. It doesn't mean that from eons ago or before he was born, he knew of any orange juice he's supposed to buy for me, and so he needs to keep it in mind. Now, it's simply it's a future remembrance where I'm stating the importance of the orange juice above, other things that may be on the list, and I'm telling him to ensure that he keeps it in mind to not forget it. This is the same thing we observe with the children of Israel. So the Sabbath here is specifically for them, and the only strangers or Gentiles who were to keep the Sabbath with Israel were the ones who were within their gates. That is, the foreigners in their household or in their enclosed cities. So this was not for the entire world. This was very specific. This was the exclusive sign of the Old Covenant for them. And the only non-Jews who were obligated to keep the Sabbath were their slaves, the Gentile servants that they had working with and for them, as well as the Gentiles who were a part of the Israelite community by living in their cities and their towns and their enclosed areas. So, but the rest of the Gentile world, the Canaanites and the Ammonites, the Moabites, and all of these people were not obligated to keep Israel's Sabbath. So that is very clear, that is very specific. And the wording of the commandment here, as I had explained before, is not saying that the Sabbath is a memorial of creation. The therefore is simply, in verse 11, strengthening the fact as to why God has given this command. The Sabbath command is, don't work, keep it holy. Why? Because I work for 6 days, I rest one, you must do the same. That's all it's saying, pattern. God is simply telling Israel to follow his pattern as a suzerain, as a king, as the one in charge. He's given them grounds and authority and reason for which he's given them this command and to follow his pattern, his authoritative pattern. He works for 6 days and rested one. He's asking him to do the same under his same authority. That's all we're seeing here. We're not seeing a command that existed from Genesis or in eternity past, as you know, the assumptions go wild, etc. All we're seeing is work for 6 days, rest on the 7th day, which could have been any day, as we had seen in the last study. And you must do this, follow my pattern, because I, God, did the same. And of course, this wasn't in every specific way the same thing that God did, because, you know, Israel's Sabbath was a weekly, you know, cyclical Sabbath, but whereas for God, his Sabbath is a perpetual, ceaseless Sabbath. So, in a miniature way, Israel's work and rest activity adumbrated God's work and rest activity, though it don't encapsulate it in its entirety. In Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 17, again, this is one of the most explicit and unequivocal facts about the Sabbath and to whom it applied in Scripture. The details are so explicit and exclusive, we have to wonder how. You know, me specifically, how did I miss these things over there as well? You know, the Ellen White goggles were on, the Assumptive Adventist glasses were on, and even how some Sabbatarians today miss these facts. It can't be more clear. And let's read them together. Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 17. The Bible says, "And the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel." Now, beloved, I know all of us we are well acquainted with the English language. Our mother tongues, most of us are English, and so we should know to read and appreciate literature within context. It did not say you American people, or say to the Haitian people, which is, you know, my nationality by birth, to the Bahamian people, my who I am by virtue of education and brought up, see, and you, my Jamaican people, also who I am now by marriage, etc. And you, my Asian people, say to you, my African people, my Spanish people, or whatever you want to fill in it. No, this is very specific, and one of the rules of biblical hermeneutics or exegesis is that we read within context. For example, who wrote whatever it is that you're reading? To whom was it written? Why was it written? Who are the specific audience? Under which context was it written? All of these questions you must ask in order to get the proper understanding of what you're reading, and after which, you know, you can make application where needs be. And so, following the rules of, you know, literature, literary context and exegesis, it's specific. Speak to the children of the people of Israel. This is not speak to the entire world. God is not an idiot, right? And we are not idiot, my beloved friends. If God wanted to save the entire world, he would have said it. But he's very specific. Speak to the people of Israel. None of us who are here right now reading this and watching are the people of Israel or were in that original audience context. Speak to the people of Israel. Above all, you shall keep my Sabbath, for it is a sign between me and you. Notice how exclusive and deliberate the language is. Right? It's a sign between me and you throughout your generation. Again, notice how exclusive the language is. Not to the generation of the planet or to every nation on earth, but throughout your generation, Israelites, that you may know that I'm the Lord who sanctifies you. Sanctify here, merely speaking of the people, Israelites who God chose for a specific focus or function. And then he continues, you shall keep the Sabbath. You, Israel, should keep the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Again, beloved, take your time and read these passages. It didn't say it's holy to me, a Haitian, Bahamian, Jamaican, to you, fellow Jamaicans, Americans, and whatever as your nationality is. It says to you, Israel, it is holy. It's not holy to the Gentiles. Everyone who profaned it should be put to death. So this is how serious the Sabbath was to God and Israel. If they profane it, they should be killed. He goes on to say, whoever does any work on it, he should be cut off from among his people. That is the Israelite covenant community. He will be cut off. That means he would be separated and put to death from the covenant community if he don't fulfill the stipulation of this covenantal sign. 6 days should work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever works on it should be put to death. Therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing it throughout their generations. I'm being deliberate with the stretching here, beloved. As a covenant forever. It's a sign forever between me, God, and the people of Israel. Because in 6 days, I made heaven and earth. On the 7th day, I rested and was refreshed. Again, the passage is so clear. The Sabbath applied to Israel. It's clear about what was its purpose, as well as the duration of time at which it would be applicable. And no less than 3 times in this passage, we see the people of Israel are explicitly singled out as the nation to whom the Sabbath applied in verse 13, 16, and 17. We also see the purpose for which the Sabbath was given. In verses 13, 16, and 17, we read that the Sabbath was a sign between God and Israel. It was exclusively a sign between God and Israel, and a covenant forever between God and Israel, that they may know they are in covenant relationship with him. It is the same way for you married ladies, that if you wear a ring, that ring is the sign of the covenant relationship between you and your husband. Not between you and the entire world of men, or between your husband and the entire world of women. I mean, this is so clear. I don't know how we can go around this and to try and make you read what it say. And again, it's very fallacious to seek to argue that the Sabbath is both an exclusive sign between God and Israel, and at the same time, it is also an exclusive sign between God and the entire world. That don't make any sense. If the entire world was keeping it, how in the world can it be an exclusive sign or special sign between God and themselves? It don't make any sense. If everybody have this style of shirt and color that I have now, how can this be a special shirt? How in the world can this be a special exclusive shirt that identify me, Elce Lauriston, as an individual, when everybody have the same shirt, same size, same color? It don't make a sense. Not an ounce of sense. But here we're seeing it makes sense when we understand contextually that the Sabbath is exclusively between God and Israel and nobody else. We also see that reiterated in, the prophets, especially Ezekiel, where in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 10 to 12 and 18 to 20, where Ezekiel is recalling Israel's history and said, this is what God said, speaking through him: I led them, Israel, out of the land of Egypt. I brought them into the wilderness. I gave them my statutes and made unto them my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them. Here's another repetition: that they might know that I'm the Lord who sanctifies them, or who sets them apart as my special people to do a special thing through them. And he says they shall keep my Sabbath in verse 20, that they may be a sign again between me and them, that they may know I'm the Lord their God. These scriptural passages could not be clearer as to the purpose of the Sabbath and to whom it applied. We can observe in Exodus 31 that the Sabbath was to endure as a sign between God and Israel throughout their generations. These scriptures demonstrate that the Sabbath was exclusively given to Israel and only had meaning and significance to them, and we soon see this. No other nation was given the Sabbath as a sign between God and themselves. No other nation was commanded to keep the Sabbath as a covenant forever to demonstrate that God set them apart as his special people. This only applied to Israel throughout their generations. There's no way, beloved friends, we who are educated and intellectual and can read within context can misunderstand and misapply these scriptural passages. Leviticus chapter 23 verses 1 to 3 we also read, "The Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the people of Israel." Here we have it again. I hope you're not annoyed by me stressing it like this, but I'm literally trying to make a point. God is specific as to who he is speaking to with regards to the Sabbath. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. These are my holy feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on the Sabbath. It is a Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. So among the appointed feasts of the Lord, the Sabbath was the first. Read Leviticus 23, you will see this clearly. It was a period of solemn rest for the people of Israel to observe in all their dwellings. Notice carefully that there's no mention of the Sabbath being a feast or a solemn rest for the Gentiles. Nor was it to be a Sabbath to God in all of their Gentile dwellings. The Sabbath continues to be confined exclusively to Israel. Now again, I'm not an idiot, beloved. I'm not the smartest of individuals around, but I am not an idiot. I'm able to read the English language. I don't know Hebrew yet, but I know Greek well enough to save myself, right? And I also the Hebrew scriptures were translated in Greek in the 3rd century BC, so I can read and decipher the Old Testament in Greek and the New Testament, and these things cannot be more exclusive and explicit, as the Bible is clearly saying here. So I'm just putting it out there. I am not an idiot. And those of you who know me, who would have heard me, who would have interacted with me on Facebook, you can see, say, yeah, I'm not the brightest or smartest, but me have little sense up here, right? So that's off the bat. I'm not an idiot. And I can see clearly that this is exclusively for Israel. It is not for me as a non-Jew, as a Gentile. It's not for you non-Jews and Gentiles. It was not for the Philistines and all the pagan nations that surrounded Israel. The Sabbaths were exclusively for the children of Israel as God's special separating commandment among others between himself and them. In Numbers chapter 28 we also read where God says to command in verses 1 and 2, the people of Israel, again, the people of Israel, my offering, my food for my food offerings, my pleasing aroma, you shall be careful to offer to me at its appointed time. In verse 9 we read, on the Sabbath, 2 male lambs a year without blemish, 2 tenths of a fine flour of ephah of grain, mixed with oil, its drink offering. This is the burnt offering of every Sabbath beside the regular burnt offering and its drink offering. So here we are seeing where double offerings were required on the Sabbath, and this was exclusively to Israel. You would not find in scripture where pagan nations were performing these sabbatical rites. You will not find where God is lambasting the Philistines and these other non-Jewish nations and giving them these stipulations. These were exclusively for Israel. And when you get to read my book, you will see why the drink offerings, etc., were offered on the Sabbath. That itself proved its ceremonial nature, and it was a shadow of Christ, as Colossians chapter 2 correctly says. The Sabbath cannot be kept in its full biblical sense without the offerings every Sabbath. as I said before, the Jews are continually baffled with this phenomenon that, you know, they can't really keep their law as they should because their temple don't stand. Without their temple, they cannot keep these regulations as they should. So in these texts, we are seeing clearly, beloved, Israel is commanded to offer these things with specificity. Gentile nations were never commanded such things. We'll search in vain, biblically and historically, to find where Gentiles were mandated by God to meet these stipulations on the Sabbath. We also read in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 15, where God says to them, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Again, my people, you were not slaves in Egypt. You were not slaves in Egypt. We, you know, black people had our, you know, history of slavery and all of these different things, but it was not in an Egyptian context 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. No. So how dare we think when we read this that this is talking to us? God says, you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord commanded you to keep the Sabbath. So now we are seeing why the Sabbath now was so special to Israel. Here, in the most unequivocal language, God states his reason for giving and commanding Israel to keep and observe the Sabbath. The Sabbath was to remind Israel that they as a people were enslaved in Egypt, and God subsequently mightily delivered them therefrom. So the Sabbath was to Israel a memento of slavery and also of redemption. No other nation falls into this category. No other nation was told to keep the Sabbath to remind them that they were slaves in Egypt and God delivered them therefrom. Every nation has its historical context under which it was born as a nation. That is why just about every nation has a different Independence Day. That is why they have their various Heroes Day and all of these different holidays that they celebrate to commemorate their respective histories, whether they gain independence, like my country of birth, Haiti, 1804, you know, we gain independence from France. Bahamas, July 10, 1973 from the British. Jamaica, August, is it August 6, Kamal? Jamaica gained independence somewhere August 6, 1963, etc. America, 1776. So every nation has its respective history, and they have days that they observe that commemorate these histories. Israel here were commanded to keep the Sabbath as a part of its history as a nation. It was enslaved in Egypt. God delivered them therefrom. So God gives them this, as it were, Independence Day celebration. This weekly repeated Sabbath or Independence Day, you know, if you please, to keep, that would remind them of who they were and what God did for them in delivering them and releasing them from, you know, the iron fist of Egypt. This here does not apply to the entire world. No other nation on earth can claim this history. None can claim to keep the Sabbath because of this history. This is exclusively for the children of Israel. And I hope that you're seeing this clearly. So right there we're seeing again, the Sabbath was exclusively for Israel, not for Gentiles, and the specific reason behind it was because they were slaves. God delivered them. He gives them it as their Independence Day celebration or remembrance sign that this was their fact, and he delivered them. It was a symbol of redemption for them, not the entire planet. We also read in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13, where Nehemiah now says to them, "You came on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven and gave them right rules and true laws, good statutes and commandments. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath and commanded them commandments and statutes and that law by Moses your servant." As Nehemiah recalled and reminded Israel of their history and establishment as a nation, he recalls that it was at Mount Sinai God made known to them the Sabbath. Indeed, a careful perusal of Exodus 16 verses 23 to 30 and Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11 reveal just that. We just looked at it. Prior to Mount Sinai, Israel did not have the Sabbath. And beloved, no matter how much we kick and scream, how much we rip out our hairs, and we shout to the top of our voices till we're hoarse, it cannot be proven biblically and historically that Israel had a weekly Sabbath before the Mount Sinai scenario. An honest reading of this chapter of Nehemiah will also reveal that the audience is Israel and the historical facts relate exclusively to themselves. So nobody else is applied to, and Nehemiah is letting them know, you, the people of Israel, this was your condition, and this is how God gave to you the Sabbath. This can't be claimed for any other nation. In Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 28 to 31, we also see in the most explicit way, and you need to follow these few texts that I'm about to give and explain now, that this is a no-brainer. The Sabbath was not for Gentiles, exclusively for Jews. Nehemiah now is reading the law to them, and here's what he says. Well, not reading the law, but speaking and recounting these things. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, and the peoples of the lands here were the Gentiles. Their wives, their sons, their daughters, and all who have knowledge and understanding, they join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord and his rules and statutes. We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land, or take their daughters for our sons. And if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or any holy day. And we will forego the crops of the 7th year and the exaction of every debt. Now this here, beloved, is a bombshell. The passage, like many others, speaks voluminously. The exiles had returned from captivity under the leadership of Nehemiah and Ezra. The city of Jerusalem was left in ruins. The wall was destroyed and the nation was in apostasy. A quick perusal of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah will reveal just this. The people had made an oath, and they took a curse upon themselves to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe all the commandments of the Lord and the statutes. Notice carefully, before they entered into this oath and curse, they separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God. This fact alone should make it obvious that the peoples of the land, which were the Gentiles, were not walking in the law of God. Had they been doing so, Israel would have no need to separate themselves from them and to join themselves to the law of God. Obviously, the Gentiles did not have the law of God, as is clearly stated in Romans chapter 2 verse 14, where it says, "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they don't have the law." The Bible is clear. Non-Jewish nations did not have Jewish laws. Also, Psalm 147 verses 19 and 20, and I saw Brother Norman Thompson posted it earlier, where the psalmist brags. It says, God declares his words to Jacob, his statutes and decrees to Israel. He has not dealt with any other nation like this. They never knew his decrees. Hallelujah. Gentile nations never knew of Israel's Sabbath. Everywhere they went as Jews, they were the ones who introduced those parts of the world to rest in one day in 7 or a Sabbath day. Here the psalmist is bragging, they didn't know it. Right? So they never had it. Notice also that among the other commitments that Israel made was not to buy from the peoples of the land, the Gentiles, on the Sabbath or on a holy day, the other holy days. The Gentiles were able to buy, sell, and carry out all of their various activities on the Sabbath because the Sabbath did not apply to them. However, because the Sabbath applied to Israel and they were obliged to keep it, they had to be careful not to fall into the temptation of buying and thus break the Sabbath. Had the Sabbath applied to Gentiles, they would not have been selling their provision and other commodities unscrupulously on the Sabbath, and neither was Israel have to separate or sever from them in order to keep it. Beloved, this is one of the most clearest passages that speak profoundly that other nations were never obligated to keep the Sabbath. Israel had to literally separate from them, took an oath, right? Put themselves under a curse to walk in God's law, to keep the Sabbath, and to don't buy from the Gentiles who come to sell on the Sabbath. If the Gentiles were keeping the Sabbath, if it applied to them, Israel would not have to do this. Gentiles will not be buying and selling on the Sabbath. This is unequivocal. We also see in Nehemiah chapter 13 verses 15 to 22. This is another bombshell, where again in the same context, surrounded by heathens, right? Israel have their peculiar law, peculiar Sabbath that they gotta keep, but the heathens are not under such scruples. Here's the situation now. This is bombshell. Follow me closely now. In those days, the Bible says, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in heaps of grains and loading their donkeys also with wine and grapes and figs and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on that day when they sold food. Tyrians also, men from Tyre, lived also in the city. They brought fish and all kinds of goods, and they sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah and in Jerusalem itself. Then Nehemiah says, I confronted the nobles of Judah and I said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing, profaning the Sabbath? Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster upon us and upon the city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath? And as soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded the doors to be shut and gave orders that they should not open the gates until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers and all kinds of ware lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, why are you lodging outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. That means he's going to beat them and, embarrass them. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves, come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath holy. This is another bombshell passage that is unequivocally clear. The Sabbath was not for Gentiles. Follow me. On his return from Persia, Nehemiah found the city of Jerusalem in carelessness. He was there before they started to build the wall, and he went back, to report some matters to the king and to abate some of the things that the enemy were saying about them, etc. And here he comes back years later now. He finds everything that he did was basically left in a state of disarray. The stipulations he put down in chapter 10, what we just read, they disregarded. Right? So they were profaning the Sabbath as Jews, etc. So here now Nehemiah comes back, and Jerusalem now is in carelessness with regards to the law of God. They had promised to refuse to buy and sell on the Sabbath, but they broke that promise. In chapter 10 verse 30 when we saw that. Nehemiah observed that the Gentiles and Tyrians had turned the Sabbath into a market day. Having observed this, Nehemiah warned the Tyrians not to do so. Follow me closely. But he treats the nobles and rulers of Judah very differently. He chides and lambasts them by reminding them that it was because of their ancestors' laxity on and the breaking of the Sabbath that they were driven into Babylonian captivity a few hundred years earlier, and that if they continue in this path, a worse evil will come upon them. Having spoken to the rulers, Nehemiah stations guards at the gates and orders them to shut the gates on the Sabbath. Despite this, the Gentiles and Tyrians still came with their merchandise to sell on the Sabbath. But what did he do? He threatened them and they ceased. A good point to observe here, beloved, is very good. It is very good to observe. The gates of Jerusalem that he ordered to be closed separated the Jews who were obligated to keep the Sabbath from the Gentiles who were not obligated to keep the Sabbath. Had the Sabbath applied to Gentiles, this would have been a good time for Nehemiah to chastise them for not observing it. But what we see here is that he chastises the rulers, and he only wants the Gentiles not to be a temptation to Israel by bringing merchandise on the Sabbath. Inside the city were the Jews keeping their Sabbath, while outside the Gentiles who could care less about the Sabbath are sitting there with their goods to sell at any time. If the Sabbath applied to Gentiles, this would have been a good opportunity for Nehemiah to say, hey, y'all need to keep the Sabbath. Stop bringing in your goods and your merchandise. You need to keep the Sabbath, you're breaking it. But we never see this in this passage. He only finds fault with them for bringing in their goods on the Sabbath to tempt the Jews, but he never commands them to observe the Sabbath. Nehemiah well knew that the Sabbath never applied to non-Jews, and this passage demonstrates just that. Again, beloved, we cannot run from these things. As a matter of fact, Nehemiah chapter 13 serves as the backdrop, and we'll see this tomorrow, for Jesus' statement in Matthew 24 verse 20, when he said to the disciples that they ought to pray that their flight may not be in the winter nor on the Sabbath, in Jerusalem. And the reason for that is because winter would have been a time that, would be very cold. They can't flee. So they would die or starve. The nation would be at war, under destruction. And the Sabbath now would be a time where they can't do much activities because they were commanded to rest. And also the gates of Jerusalem were to be closed. When you do your historical research on this in Judaism, you would see that after this incident in Nehemiah chapter 13, every Sabbath the Jews closed the gates of Jerusalem. And so if the enemy is outside coming in to destroy everything that's inside, as we saw in AD 70 with Cestius Titus, the Roman general, if the gates are closed, then obviously the disciples can't run out, they would be destroyed. That's why Jesus said to them, pray that your flight don't be at winter, when it's not commodious to run, as well as not on the Sabbath, when the gates will be locked and there'd be no escape and you will die. But history tells us no Christian lost their lives at the destruction of Jerusalem. They fled to Pella, they were saved. But most of the Jews, they got killed. So right here we are saying, beloved, unequivocally, the Sabbath was not for non-Jews. It was exclusively for the Jews, and Gentiles weren't under it. Isaiah chapter 56 is another one that reveals this, where God says, happy is the man who observes the Sabbath and keeps it from desecrating it, keeps his hand from doing evil. No foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord should say, hey, the Lord has excluded me from his people. The eunuch should say, behold, I'm a dry tree. Then the Bible says, for thus says the Lord, the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath and choose what please me and hold firm to my covenant, I'll give them a name and a memorial better than sons of daughters. And the Gentiles, the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him and to hold firm to his Sabbath and keep his covenant, he will accept their burnt offerings and their prayer upon the altar, and his house will be called a house of prayer for all people. What are we seeing here? Firstly, God here is applauding the eunuchs, who felt like they were a dry tree. That is, they can't produce, as their entire male member were cut off, as we had seen. And by virtue of their male member being cut off, they cannot be circumcised and thus become a part of the covenant community. And the Gentiles who join themselves to God should not feel like they're second-class citizens. Gentiles were not expected to naturally keep the Sabbath, as it was the sign between God and Israel exclusively. However, God made provision in the law that any Gentile or foreigner who wanted to enter into and keep his covenant must be circumcised first, after which they would be considered citizens of Israel and fall under the covenant. You can read this in Exodus chapter 12, verses 43 to 49. So in this passage, the foreigners who joined themselves to the Lord there did so through the rite of circumcision. Circumcision was the entry sign into the Judaic or Old Israelite covenant. So the foreigners now, they circumcised and they joined themselves to Israel. They were considered blessed to keep the Sabbath and God's covenant. And the eunuchs who could not be circumcised, God made provision that they could just keep it. They could just offer their prayers and their burnt offerings and have faith in him and take hold of his covenant to do it, and he would accept and receive their worship. So special provision here was made for the eunuchs who could not be circumcised like everybody else, and the Gentiles are encouraged, once they are circumcised and joined to the Lord their God through it, they can keep the Sabbath, they can be circumcised, God accepts them. This is what we're seeing here. In Ezekiel, the leaders were chastised for allowing uncircumcised Gentiles to enter the sanctuary and to keep charge of God's holy things. And so God toughened the law by saying, no foreigner, no uncircumcised in heart and flesh of all the foreigners who are among the people of Israel shall enter my sanctuary. You can find this in Ezekiel chapter 44 verses 7 to 9. Circumcision took precedence over the Sabbath. Again, before you can keep the Sabbath and the law of Israel, you had to first be circumcised. Circumcision took precedence over the Sabbath. John chapter 7 verses 22 to 24 reveal this in Jesus' conversation with the Jews, when he says, you know, if circumcision time, you know, the 8th day of a child fall on the Sabbath, despite circumcising on that day would be work, you still have to circumcise them, because that trumps the Sabbath law. Before you're considered a Jew, you have to be circumcised. Before you can keep the Sabbath, you had to be circumcised. It took precedence. And again, do some proper Jewish studies and you would see this. That is why we see, as I said earlier, the last week's study, that the New Testament focuses more so on circumcision versus uncircumcision, because by covering circumcision they are covering the entire law. So in Acts chapter 15, when the Jerusalem Council threw out circumcision, they threw out the entire Mosaic law, including the Sabbath, and they gave certain stipulations for Gentiles, some that they had already under the Noahide covenant of Genesis chapter 9, as well as some ceremonial stipulations like avoiding eating blood and strangle animals, so that they can have the Gentiles could have table fellowship with their Jewish Christian brethren. So when the New Testament removes circumcision, it's naturally removing the mandatory nature of Sabbath keeping. Emil G. Herx states, circumcision also took precedence over the Sabbath, though whatever preparations for this rite can be completed previously should not be left for the Sabbath. And this here now, you can find this statement in the JewishEncyclopedia.com, and the article is the Sabbath. You'll be able to find this, where a Jew is letting us know these things about his religion, his law, his Sabbath. Again, the Jews continue to defend to this very day that the Sabbath is a sign, exclusive sign, between themselves as Jews and God, not the entire Gentile world. Gentiles were expected to keep the 7 laws of Noah, and the Sabbath was not among those 7 laws. So simply put, beloved, before anyone could have kept the Sabbath, you had to be circumcised first. The foreigner in Isaiah 56 is commended by God for having gone under the rite of circumcision, and therefore now can legitimately keep the Sabbath along with his covenant people, the Jews. And the eunuch who just take hold of the covenant because the provision is made, because he can't be circumcised, just keep the things and God will bless him and make his name a memorial, and he's good to go. So right there we are seeing, beloved, from these few passages we look at, the Sabbath was not a universal command for the entire world. Non-Jewish nations were foreign to the concept of keeping every 7th day of the week as a Sabbath. The Jews before Exodus chapter 16 were foreign to the idea of keeping the Sabbath every 7th day. As a matter of fact, again, read my book and you see this. They were coming out of Egypt that had a 10-day week, and now God cuts it down by 3 days and gives them 7 days and commands them to obey the 7th. Again, research these things for yourselves. Don't just take my word for it. But like I tell you, I'm a Sabbatarian buff and apologist. and I search out these things. I have all the requisite authorities on this. I have also authored a book on this, and some of you are currently reading it, and you have been giving me some wonderful feedback how you're enjoying what you're reading so far. So again, I have done my requisite homework. I'm not just beating my gum, or I'm just talking because I want to hear myself. These are biblical and historical facts that no serious Bible scholar can circumvent or say, as we would say in Jamaica, nothing no go so, or nothing goes like this. That is not true. No, non-existent. All respected Bible scholars, right, historians and Jewish scholars and Jews themselves unanimously agree the Sabbath is exclusive to Israel. Non-Jews, Gentiles were never commanded it. As a matter of fact, I'll show you later where they had even put a law in place that non-Jews who ventured to keep the Sabbath without being circumcised were liable to be stoned to death. All of these things are there. These are historical facts, beloved. When Ephesians chapter 2 speaks of the wall of hostility that divided Jews and Gentiles, the Sabbath was one of those walls. It was circumcision, the Sabbath, their dress code, and their diet. These things were exclusive to Jews. Everywhere they went, they were identified by these things. That's what the word sanctified they're referring to. Set apart as an identifying marker. So, again, I don't know how much more I can stress it, but do your research. Look up these things for yourself. Do all the linguistical studies you can. Check respected Bible commentaries. I can recommend you some books. I tell you, I have a plethora of books, articles, and research papers on Sabbatarianism, as well as a few studies that I've written myself on this that I can email to you for free if you require to check these things out for yourselves. As I said, the Line for God research team that I'm a part of, we have some of the top researchers you can find around. I'm telling you, from English professionals, lawyers, Greek scholars, I mean, you name it. We contact the top Israelite scholar right now, Dr. Reuven Bruno in Israel, about these matters, and he's confirming what we're saying. So again, I'm not just beating my gum. We have done the requisite research, and I'm able to show you these things and to share these facts with you. The Sabbath was not for the world, exclusively for the Jews, and before you can keep it and be a part of it, you have to be circumcised. Also, let me give you these few texts before, well, as I close, about the Sabbath. Jeremiah chapter 17 verses 19 to 27, where Jeremiah lambasts and rebuked the leaders of Jerusalem for desecrating the Sabbath. Again, this is why they went into captivity. Lamentations chapter 1 verse 7, where it says, this is now after the Jeremiah captivity. In those days, it says, her affliction and ruin, Jerusalem remembers all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, with no one to help her. The adversaries saw her downfall, and they mocked at her. So Jerusalem was mocked when it was destroyed. And in chapter 2 verse 6, here's what God says during this time now. The Lord has caused the appointed festivals and the Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion. In his burning indignation, he has spurned the king and the priest. So because of their apostasy here, by their wickedness and desecrating the Sabbath, God dashed away. That is, he threw away all the Sabbath. He caused them to be forgotten. They cannot keep it in captivity. They couldn't keep it in their dire strait and that state of ruin. The feasts and the Sabbaths were forgotten. God rejected the king and the priest, the civil and the religious leader, again, exclusively to Israel. No other Gentile nation you'll read these things about. Ezekiel chapter 20, Ezekiel chapter 22, Ezekiel chapter 23, you also see this where the priests and rulers are rebuked for profaning the Sabbath. We never see where Gentile nations or rulers are rebuked for profaning any Sabbath. Also Hosea chapter 2 verse 11, where God threatened, because of their apostasy, to take away all of their feasts, new moons, and Sabbaths. Everything. And also in Amos chapter 8 verse 5, the Jews, they anticipated the passing of the Sabbath so that they could commit fraud and wickedness. So the simple and brief analysis of these scripture passages, beloved, unanimously reveal that the Sabbath and its observance was significant and binding on the Jewish nation alone. It was God's covenant sign between himself and them. It was not a commandment or sign between God and non-Jewish or Gentile nations. The only way Gentiles became obligated to keep the Sabbath was if they became circumcised and enter into God's covenant relationship with Israel. The Sabbath was not obligatory on Gentiles then, and it is definitely not obligatory on Christians today. As that old covenant is relinquished, abolished, done away with, I hope that these brief, but exposing additional understanding and things from the Word of God give you a better understanding and liberate you regarding those who are trying to push on you mandatory Sabbatarianism. I thank you for your patience, for enduring with me as we looked at this study. I hope that you were blessed, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as I close this video. And again, those of you who are able, make good use of my book. Again, most of who I've gotten a review from believe that this is the shortest and most powerful anti-Sabbatarian material that they read within 90 pages. So the book is well stocked with information, with biblical and historical and linguistical facts that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Christians under the new covenant are not obligated to keep any day holy. That remains a matter of personal conviction about any day that a Christian wants to keep. So if you want to keep Sunday, Saturday, Friday, Monday, whatever, it's between you and God. These things are not salvific issues, and it's really up to you as to what you will do and your religious ritual and Christian walk with the Lord. So thank you very much. Those of you who are joining late, you can watch the replay. Hopefully tomorrow I'll be back where I'll look at some popular Sabbatarian proof text and give you a better understanding of them. So thank you for spending time with me, and I really hope that this study brought a blessing to you and was very enlightening. Again, if there's something you don't understand, some questions you want to ask, feel free to ask and I'll be able to accommodate them a little later on. So have a blessed evening, and thank you for your time.